Welcome to Earthtide Studios. I'm Zach Knight, and in today's video, we are looking at how to mix a monstrous snare. Getting your snare right is a huge part of modern production, and when you've got layers of heavy guitars, bass, the rest of your drums, 10 layers of vocals, it's sometimes hard to get it to poke through the mix. But I'm going to give you a whole bunch of tips to make that at least possible for you. This is my approach to mixing a snare. There are many ways to do it, so it's not the be all and end all, but I'm sure it'll be able to help at least you get started. We also have a free vocal production course available that teaches you the basics of recording, engineering, editing, and mixing your vocals. If you want to grab that, it's yours. Just click the link below and it's free. But for now, let's bring out the monster in that snare. So we've got the session open in Cubase, guys, and today we are looking at mixing a snare, namely a monstrous snare, inside an alternative kind of heavy track. This is Therapy by Color and Shade, and I'm specifically going to run over this particular section in the song. I'll just play it for you now without vocals. As you can see, the snare is pretty huge, but actually quite dynamic as well. And realistically, it was kind of fun to get that going in the production. We ended up going with 2 snare top microphones as well as a snare bottom. I've got a room sample blended in there as well. And we've also got a stereo room and a mono room mic as well. This was recorded at a studio called Echidna Studios in Australia. It's got an awesome huge room, and the room sound in both that room and the room sample are playing a big part in getting this snare sounding huge. And obviously, the performance is definitely helping with those dynamics as well. A key point of how I'm processing the snare in this mix is that the snare top 2, and bottom mic are all running into a bus, which is then where all the processing is happening, and that's going to a drum bus. Additionally, the snare room sample is also going straight to the drum bus and not going to this snare bus here. So first up in the chain, we are looking at the gate. Now, I'm actually using the Cubase gate on this particular mix, and what I'm really doing is I'm setting the gate so it's not getting rid of all of the excess noise. It's just getting most of the noise besides the snare, but it's open enough to be able to make sure that I'm getting all of the dynamics that are coming from this performance. So have a listen to just the snare on its own, and I'll take off the snare room. Now you'll notice there's a few points there where it dips out a little bit. That's where it's the snare performance isn't happening. That's actually tom hits there. And otherwise there's still like a reasonable amount of excess noise coming through. If you listen when it kicks in afterwards. You can hear that the hats are still sort of sitting a little bit in the background, because completely removing them is going to sort of affect the snare a little bit too much in terms of the processing, and it means that you're going to have to fight to try and keep a lot of the natural snare sound in there. So that's why I've left it a bit more open, and the way I've dealt with that is I've just made sure that the range is only sitting at minus 30 dB rather than pumping the range to something like, minus 70 or something along those lines. Because then it just means that it's only getting rid of a certain amount of signal and it's still leaving some left over. The attack is super fast, the hold is super fast, and I've got an auto release here. And the threshold is set basically to just allow those small snares to still come through, and obviously the main big snare spikes are appearing there. It's pretty common for me also to go through and automate the threshold of the gate, to go through and adjust it for different sections. In this particular case, it worked fine across this section, but in other parts of this mix, I have needed to automate it to be able to make sure that I'm not picking up non-snare parts inside this snare section. Next up in the chain, we're looking at saturation, and I'm actually using the Slate virtual channel here. I love this just for a little bit of saturation. It works really quite nicely. I've got it on the Brit 4KE setting here, a little bit of drive, removing that noise, like having the noise reduction on there because I don't need excess noise to be added. And yeah, it's just coming through and getting a little bit of signal. This is something it's very subtle. So you're definitely going to struggle hearing this on phone or something along those lines. You probably want to be using headphones to be able to hear this, or obviously if you've got a good studio environment, that'll help. So let's have a listen to it. It's really quite subtle. It's just adding a little bit of saturation. Following along from saturation, we are looking at some transient shaping, and the plugin that I'm using today is Transify by JST Plugins. It's pretty useful. It allows you to adjust the transient of the sound that you're using in different areas of the frequency range. So in this particular case, for instance, I have got all 4 ones set up, but I'm adjusting the amount of attack and sustain that there are in each of them in different amounts. In most of the cases, on this case, I'm not really going to adjust the sustain. Sometimes I do. This is also a really useful tool for voiceover work. So it's a very dynamic plugin in terms of, you know, different things that you can use it for. So don't feel like you just need to use it on drums. You could probably find a lot of uses for this one. But anyway, in this particular case on the drums, I'm really boosting a little bit of the transient around the 200 mark, which is where a lot of the body of the snare is. Then I'm giving it a bit more cut, not necessarily as much because this is a pretty cutty snare. And then after that, we've got sort of more of the main sort of, you know, mid-range crack of the snare, and then just a little bit on the top end as well. So let's play what that's doing. It's really just making the transient of the snare pop out a little bit more, giving it a little bit more body, a little bit more attack, and yeah, just really just pushing it a little bit harder. Now we're getting to a really key component here with the mixing of the snare, and of course that means EQ. So I'm using FabFilter Pro Q2. Now I've done a couple of different moves in here. You can see I've got a few extra EQ sections here that I use for some sweeping. We'll just get rid of those. They're not running anyway. The first thing that I've done is rolled off the bottom end of this snare, because all of this information below 60 hertz there for the drums is where things are going to sit for the kick, and maybe a little bit of the floor tom as well. So you really don't need that extra information. I'll show you what it sounds like. You don't need that on the snare. So we want to be getting rid of that. I'm cutting it out at 12 dB an octave. After that, on the other end, I'm also doing a rolling off the high end at about 16.5K as well. This is cymbal land. You don't need to have your shells up in that area. I mean, we definitely like to have bright and attacky, you know, snares in this kind of stuff most of the time. But in this case, you do not need to have that kind of area. I mean, have a listen to it. It's just not needed. So I'll turn those two off for you, and you can see what it sounds like when we have them both off. I'll go one more time. As much as we're removing frequencies, it actually really tightens up the drum and definitely makes that snare sound a little bit more under control. The next key thing is I'm boosting the body of the snare. We talked about how 200 hertz is usually around where the body of the snare sits. In this particular case, it was for this one. So I'm boosting at 1.5 dB here with small bell. And straight after that, I'm actually cutting at about 250 to get rid of this annoying noise. Just really quite undesirable. Whereas this sound is really pushing the body of the snare. So we'll get rid of those two, and you can have a listen. It really pushes the body of the snare and also cleans up any of that muddiness there. Then, of course, you know, we're talking about a snare drum here. It's usually notorious for having a lot of ring. This is where the main ring of the snare is sitting, and I'm getting rid of a decent amount of it, 5.8 dB, and it's at 490 hertz. Usually you need to sweep around for this kind of thing. Listen out for it. I mean, you can see it in a lot of visual EQs, but you always don't want to just mix with your eyes. Use your ears as well and see if you can find this. I'll show you what it sounds like. And I'll turn it off so that you can hear what it sounds like in the mix without it. There, it just definitely helps get rid of that ring if that's the thing that you want to do in your mixes. After that, I'm just getting rid of another little section here of a bit of honky kind of noise. Boosting the crack of the snare at about 2000. It's just giving it a little bit more of a focus and just making it poke out a little bit more. And then after that, getting rid of a little bit of extra high-end energy that we didn't need sitting here at just under 6K. Like that really kind of sizzly, kind of sibilanty kind of frequency. You don't really want to have that in your snare. It's usually going to be sitting more like that in vocals. And then boosting the high end of the snare just because it was a bit dark. Now I'll turn off this one here and we can show you what it sounds like without the boost in the high end. Now, it really does make it poke through. It does come out a little bit sizzly, and so that's why we need to make sure that we control that in the mix. After EQ, we are looking at compression, and in this particular mix, I like to use FabFilter Pro C2. I just went with a 4:1 ratio on the punch setting. It's got a moderate attack, a pretty fast release. And other than that, I just set the threshold to be able to grab a decent amount of compression. I think we're going for 4 to 6. And I'll play it when it kicks in a bit more. And we'll just turn off all the reverb so you can hear that a bit better. It's really compressing that snare down and just giving it a lot more punch and pushing it out a lot more as well. After EQ, we're looking at a little bit more saturation here. I like to use the virtual tape machines by Slate. I've got this one set here on the 1/2-inch 2-track machine type, and the tape is on the FG456 setting. I've got 30 IPs running, and I've also set up in my settings as well to make sure that the hiss auto mute is on, the noise reduction's been brought down a little bit, and you remove the bass alignment that it normally has in its default settings. Once you've done that, by the way, if you want to save it as a default setting to have that done there, just make sure you go into your section here in your DAW and save it as a preset. And then after that, like save it as a default preset. And then when you load it up, it'll already be there. so you don't have to manually adjust that every time you put the plugin on a new instance in a channel. So I'll show you what it sounds like with that saturation now. Without. So it's really just smoothing out the high end there, and it's also adding a little bit of a low end bump. I kind of like the way that it deals with that, and I think it sounds really nice on the snare. After saturation, I like to put limiting on the snare. I'm using the Waves L1 limiter. This is just set to shave off a little bit of the top of the snare, just to sort of make sure that it's not going to be hitting the stereo bus compressor that I'll be running on the drum bus, and any bus compression I've got running on my master bus as well, because the snare is usually notoriously quite loud in a mix. So in this particular case, I want to really make sure that I'm controlling that before it's hitting those bus compressors, and hopefully not sending them off, you know, with too much compression and affecting the rest of the volume of the mix. So we'll just have a look here and see what attenuation it's doing. It's not much, it's just controlling the level. So really not that much, just controlling the level of that snare there. So when I'm thinking about sample reinforcement for my snare mixing, I'm usually going to be using Slate Trigger 2. This is a really good plugin to be able to throw in your drum samples and reinforce any shells that you're doing on a kit. In this particular case, this is for the snare. I'm using this snare sample. It's got quite a lot of crack to it, not too much body, and it certainly is going to provide a lot more poke to that snare and make it push through and make it sound quite large. In this particular case, I'm only running it at 30% mix, so it's not really doing that much in terms of the snare mix itself. I've got the dynamics quite restricted on it, and that way it's making sure it's just mostly providing a lot of power. I've also adjusted the tuning of the sample to match the actual original snare recording. You want to make sure that you play around with the tuning and get it to match, because otherwise it's definitely not going to sit nice as well. And you also want to be making sure that as you play through, you're listening to the phase of the snare sample and making sure that your snare sample is in phase with your regular snare. So you're going to want to click your phase button on and off until you can hear that it is in phase. Or alternatively, if you wanted to, you could also print the snare sample and then actually just look at it visually versus your original snare and see whether or not it was in phase. And if it's not in phase, you need to put it in phase, usually by inverting it. If you have trouble with getting it in phase by doing this as well, the other thing you can do is you can manually move the snare sample and rebounce it and then re-put it into Trigger 2, or you can use the Auto Align plugin. But let's have a listen to what this snare sample is adding to this section here. And I've also adjusted the detail to make sure that the snare sample is only picking up the peaks, the hard hits, and that's where the sample is being applied. It's actually not being applied on those softer hits, and definitely not on any ghost notes. I'll play that section without trigger. So as you can see, it's really only just being applied there on those harder hits and providing a bit more attack for those with that sample. Lastly, I am doing a little bit of EQ on the actual snare channel bus itself. This is just a little bit of a high boost here. I've got 5.7 dB at about 5,500 hertz. That's just a bit of a high shelf to add a little bit more crack to the snare. And I'm also getting rid of a little bit of annoying frequency here at about 210. So I'll play you the section without that first. add it in. It's adding quite a lot, really, but it's not that large a move, but it's adding quite a lot of that high end there. On the snare bus, I'm actually sending it to a number of different places as well. In this case, the first thing I'm doing is sending it to a snare room bus pre-fader as well at 0 dB, which means that any adjustments I make to automation on this channel won't affect how it sends through to the sample. I'm running the sample through Trigger 2 off this snare room bus. I'm playing with this sample. I've made sure that it's in phase. I've made sure that I've checked the tuning of it as well to make sure it matches with the rest of the snares there. And I'm actually controlling the volume for it. So I've just got 100% wet mix here and controlling the volume for it from the bus and just making sure that it's triggering only on all of the hard hits. So it's not triggering on any of the ghost notes or any of the soft stuff going on in there. I'm just going to turn off the other reverb there and we'll play with this now and hear what it sounds like. It's pretty big. It definitely adds a huge amount of that room sound to it and it makes it sound really quite large and massive. Also, as you've noticed, I've turned off two things here. I've got a drum reverb that I'm using. Now, this particular drum reverb I'm doing here is the Valhalla Room Reverb. This is an awesome reverb, and I'm currently using the A plate setting here. Made sure that I've gotten rid of a little bit of the high end in there, and I actually saved this as a preset for myself so that I can just grab this anytime. And inside the actual channel itself as well, I've set up the EQ to remove a whole bunch of low end there as well, because we just don't need that extra low end there. I did this to make, to save a lot of room in terms of CPU and power for this mix, because I did this mix on an old computer, which certainly didn't have as much power as my current computer does. Now I'll probably use an instance of FabFilter Pro Q2 to give me a little bit more control over the EQ adjustments to the reverb, but it worked really well. And I'll show you what this sounds like here. Let's just turn it on. I'm sending it straight to that bus at 0 dB, by the way, and I'm just controlling the volume of the actual drum reverb bus, which is then going to control the volume of that reverb rather than worrying about controlling the volume of the send. Because in that particular case, I'm just adjusting the volume that's being sent to that reverb by the send volume for everything else. So in this particular case, the snare is at maximum, but like the toms here, they're sitting at maximum of wet as well. But other things like the overheads, for instance, I've sent them to the reverb at -6. The other reverb that I'm using here is a gated snare that I have also used Valhalla Room for. I'm having that sent also at 0 dB and controlling the volume here. It's turned down quite a lot actually. And in this particular case, I've just got it set on the medium gate preset and it sounds pretty cool. It just adds a little bit of an extra nice sort of reverb that has that gated kind of sound to it. So we'll play it. It helps out a lot. And the final key factor to make sure you've got a really good snare is actually thinking about how you're mixing your rooms. In this particular case, I've got the stereo rooms and also a mono room running through to this bus here, which I'm scooping out a little bit of the low end there. And then after that, I'm using the Rock My Room preset from CLA 76 with waves. This is just set here to provide a lot of compression. And then after that, I've gone through, removed a bunch of the low end, removed a bunch of annoying frequencies, and I'll show you what that room sounds like just on its own. I'll remove the plugins on it. And back on. It's really compressing that, and it's also really removing all the unneeded stuff. Also, on that particular channel, I've gotten rid of this really annoying frequency here. Let's show what it sounds like. So that's in the cymbals. I've just gotten rid of that because we don't need it. So we'll put the snare back on and we'll play the rooms with that and all of the sends, and we'll have a listen to it. Really adds a lot of extra power to that. So we'll play the whole drum kit together. Turn the rooms off. Turn the sample off. And play it with everything else. It's pretty big. So those are my tips on how to make your snare nice and big for a modern production. But there's many ways to mix a snare, and I'd really love to hear your favorite record with your favorite snare. Hit me up in the comments, let me know, and let me know how you would approach mixing that. Also, don't forget the free vocal production course if you'd like that. Click the link below, but for now, take it easy.
Stop